Hello, everyone. So my interest is in the changes in this rupture, as it is described by many, that was brought by the socialist regime. As elsewhere in the Baltics, also in Latvia, the Soviet regime meant that the nationalist ideology was changed with the socialist one. It was a huge change of paradigms, and it meant that creation, consumption, and also the research of cultural practices were under the rule of Marxist and Leninist vision. And so I ask in this presentation how these huge changes affected the intellectual biographies of those who were active both before the Soviet occupation as well as after it. And therefore, in this presentation, I'll offer you insights into a particular case study of Latvian artist Jēkabs Bīne, and more specifically his research on folk ornament. And I'll try to zoom into his personal experience and compare his thinking on the same topic under these two ideologies, nationalist and socialist one. Okay, how do I? Sorry, the next slide. So my theoretical thinking has been influenced a lot by the Soviet postcolonial studies, and especially the work of Estonian scholar Epanos and late Stalinism and the changes that it brought with it in the Baltic countries often has been described as a rupture, either this traumatic rupture or radical rupture. And however, as Anus writes, this rupture caused something that is called a discursive confusion. And with that, she means that society cannot replace suddenly and completely its dominant value systems. Therefore, there was this general insecurity of how to act and what to say during this era. And when we think about this, then certain actions could be seen as resistance or cultural opposition to Soviet regime. However, I think that in some cases it is rather this discursive confusion that Anus writes about, not the resistance or opposition. And I also think that often this evaluation that takes place in the contemporary situation, then people are somehow people who experience the Soviet regime and played by the rules. They feel that they are obliged to say that this was just an act for them, that they also played their part on the outside, but the inner feelings were different, somehow uncomfortable to admit the opposite. And another theoretical inspiration for me has been the work by Jan Grill, who has studied the reconceptualization of the term folk in the early socialist era in Czechoslovakia. And he has coined something which is called ideological tuning. And he writes that these are selective interventions that are contributed to the crystallization of images of pure and progressive traditions that were nevertheless highly selective and totally devoid of all Christian or other religious traits and influences. So it means that, and as we heard in many presentations before, folk culture was a very useful tool for building socialism. However, this authenticity had to be a politically correct one. And now let's turn to the specific case study. As I mentioned before, my research topic is folk ornaments. And those of you who were present yesterday and listened to presentation by Eva Klekot might remember how she pointed out that what is perceived as folk art is very much shaped by how scholars have defined it. And in this regard, in the case with Latvian folk ornament, it is also so. So in the next slide, um, you see only a small insight into the intellectual biography of artist Jēkabs Bīne, and he has influenced folk ornament a lot, how it is perceived today, especially in the popular discourses. And but yes, in the slide, these are just small insights, and I have specifically also maybe pointed out the points in his career after the Soviet occupation, because often they are left out or mentioned in remorse. So as to the ornament, Bīne was one of the most active promoters of mythological interpretation of Latvian ornament, and on what this means. It means that there's a system where certain elements of Latvian ornament are matched with mythological concepts. So there's a lot of vernacular theorizing and understanding of mythology. And during the interwar period, Bīne actively worked on this and promoted his ideas both in publications and periodicals and also in his artwork, and definitely by his involvement in the Dievturi movement. And one of the most often applied research directions in Latvian mythology is connected with comparative linguistics and theory of Proto-Indo-European language. And these ideas also affected how mythology was perceived, because it was kind of tempting to assume that linguistic similarities could lead also to similarities in culture. And Bīne also used these ideas, and for him it meant that the development of ornament was expressed from evolution to Indo-Europeans, to Balts, and then to Latvians. And now we get to the specific example. This is the drawing from one of the Bīne's articles in the periodicals, where he explained his ideas and analyzed the specific ornaments. And what you can see in front of you is the ornament of zigzag. Illustration is from 1936 and is created in the spirit of cultural nationalism and is overall consistent with Bīne's ideas in that time. And just to give short insights, he writes that zigzag is the visual representation of Mara, and Mara is one of the main deities in Latvian mythology. And Bīne explains how Mara represents all the material world, the water, land, air, and all that is liquid belongs to her. And here he also makes this connection with the zigzag, because he believes that for the Indo-Europeans, the water commonly is represented by a zigzag, either angular or waved. And another argument for Bīne is that often this ornament is found on the objects that are connected with moisture, like boats, bowls, mugs, or vases. And you also see that he draws comparisons with other cultures. And now I offer to take a look at how Bīne interpreted the same element of ornament after the Soviet occupation. And this second illustration is not earlier than 1953 and is coherent with the methodology of Marxism and Leninism. And if before, as I try to demonstrate, Bīne used the ideas of theory of Proto-Indo-European language, now he illustrates the development of ornament in line with historical materialism. And here the history is seen as the development of productive forces, meaning that these productive forces correspond to a particular stage of economic development or their mode of production. So you can see there is community, slavery, feudalism, capitalism, socialism. The last one should have been communism, but Bīne has not yet imagined what the communist zigzag would look like. So the highlight of this evolutionary depiction of history undoubtedly is the flag of the Latvian SSSR. And this represents the socialist mode of production, and ironically, or maybe not, this does not totally lose Bīne's previously expressed ideas on the connection with water and its depiction in the form of zigzag. because the wavy line in the Latvian SSR flag represented the sea, as it actually did also in the Estonian flag. And if in the writing the quotes by Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Stalin functioned as signposts of truth, and here I'm quoting Annus again, then here I see this flag of Latvia and SSSR as this ultimate signpost visually. It condenses all the main Soviet symbols. It has red color, hammer and sickle, five-pointed star, and as a flag of Latvia and SSSR, it marks this occupied territory and subordination to the Soviet Empire. And in Bīne's work, I see it as attempt or as conformity to Soviet colonial discourse, because in his cultural production in this work was shaped by this forced reorganization and influence from outside. And of course, besides this, Bīne's own approach to this topic, there's one more difference. And if during the interwar period, Bīne was active in public sphere with this topic, then after the war, due to his nationalistic past, he had to keep a low profile, and only with some maybe even notorious exceptions, his work on the Ornament was not known to public. This was a part of a larger manuscript on which he was working on, and now is kept at the archives. And today, when we look at these hybrid creations, where the interwar or what we think of as nationalist imagery is mixed with Soviet elements, we find them bizarre and awkward, as out of place. But this is nothing unique to Latvia. I would say there are a lot of and many examples also elsewhere of this, and I'll show just some of them. For example, you see this Petrikivka, which is a Ukrainian folk painting technique, and during Soviet rule, it was not uncommon that these folk artists created portraits with Soviet heroes and Red Army soldiers, and even cosmonaut Gagarin, alongside with traditional floral ornaments and depictions of everyday life of Ukrainians. And then there on the right, there are also examples of the Soviet Russia itself, and this is tradition of Palekh miniature painting that relied a lot on the tradition of Russian Orthodox religious icons with roots at least in the 16th century. And as Andrew Jenks has described, that already in the 1920s, Palekh artists Sovietized themselves to forge this new Soviet folk art, and therefore also alongside Russian folk motifs, they had these new topics of Soviet leaders, partisans, construction projects, Stakhanovites, and so on, which were painted on this black lacquered papier-mâché boxes. And to try to understand this, I have to return to back to the relationship between form and content. And this was something that Elohanna Seljama already pointed out yesterday in her lecture, that forms tend to outlive the contents, therefore permitting different, even ambiguous messages. And Seljama writes that Soviet nationality policies regarded native languages, native dress, and also other native cultural forms as temporary vehicles for spreading socialist ideology on the way to communism. And also this is in line on what Grill writes about ideological tuning. And even though it was the socialist content that had to dominate, this continuity of the native forms was what somehow established trust, because it conveyed a sense of continuity amid this drastic political, social, and economic changes, which, as I said in the beginning of the presentation, often are described as a rupture. And to conclude, when thinking about this hybridity that was caused by the Soviet regime, consider, for example, the case with folk dances. And as described by Estonian scholar Sille Kapper, folk dance is an example of successful hybridization between Estonian and Soviet forms. And she has described how the ballet technique-based choreographies that were completely foreign to traditional Estonian folk dance became actually a part of it and and these influences of Soviet colonial rule have remained deeply embedded in Estonian collective bodily memory, and I'm convinced that this is also the case with the Latvian folk dances, that the same processes took place. But on the other hand, there are examples when this hybridity imposed by the Soviet rule was too alien to lay roots in the culture permanently, such as, for example, Soviet folklore. Also, with this awkward feeling today, we look at those folk songs collected during the first decade of Soviet Latvia that praise Stalin, happy life in kolkhozes, or friendship of the peoples. And in the similar way, the hybridity that we saw in the example of Bīne's work is something that is not a part of the today's tradition. In the interpretation of Latvian folk ornament, there has been a return to the pre-war interwar tradition with, I'd say, with no remarkable influences like we see in some other cases. And this is it from me. And if someone is interested in the sources I have used, thanks.